लाइफ में लेना देना तो चलता रहता है। इधर फ्लेक्सी लोन से बोरो कर लिया और उधर बाय मॉम डैड का वेकेशन डन। शादी का डिसीजन लिया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से और बोरो किया। प्रमोशन मिला तो ये लो थोड़ा लोन वापस कर दिया, थैंक यू। नए इंटीरियर्स का दिल किया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से फिर थोड़ा ले लिया। ईयर एंड बोनस मिला तो इस बार लोन ज्यादा वापस कर दिया। लाइफ में लेना देना चलता रहेगा तो लोन्स में क्यों नहीं। इसीलिए फ्लेक्सी लोन फ्रॉम बजाज फिनसर्व एक ऐसा लोन जो जब चाहे बोरो करे, जैसे चाहे रीपे करे, वो भी चुटकी में। थिंक इट डन विद बजाज फिनसर्व।
हेलो, हर सीजन के लिए नए इंटीरियर्स?
हाँ, वो भी हर रूम के लिए।
फ्रिज, स्मार्टफोन या बड़ा टीवी?
तीनों क्यों नहीं?
अरे ये तो शॉपिंग लिस्ट में नहीं था।
सो अब शॉपिंग कार्ट में तो है। सॉरी।
अच्छा, नए आउटफिट्स की विश लिस्ट।
विश क्यों? Just add to cart and buy.
तो ये सब EMI पे?
और वो भी चुटकी में। On India's fastest growing EMI network. Think it done with Bajaj Finserv.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट डन।
माँ के बेडरूम का एसी या लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई। पुणे, पटना, चेन्नई, मथुरा या फिर बेगूसराय, या फिर बेगूसराय। नए घर के लिए चाहिए 4K टीवी हाई फाई, या फिर वाइफ को चाहिए लेटेस्ट स्टाइल। EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI। मॉड्यूलर किचन में पुराना फ्रिज क्यों है भाई?
शादी है नहीं, मैट्रेस पुराना है भाई। अक्खा इंडिया बोले भाई प्राइजेस है हाई, बेस्ट ही खरीदना है तो अपने EMI स्टोर पर आए।
EMI है ना, EMI।
अब काशी हो या वाशी, महंगा लगी तो EMI और बेस्ट ही चाहिए तो भी EMI, क्योंकि बजाज फिनसर्व का EMI है ना। विजिट www.emistore.com।
EMI है ना, EMI है ना, EMI।
धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। इंश्योरेंस फ्रॉड से बचना है बहुत जरूरी जी। वो एजेंट है या फ्रॉड पता लगाओ जी। एक्स्ट्रा ऑफर के झांसे में कहीं फंस ना जाओ जी। अगर कोई अनजान कॉलर इंश्योरेंस पॉलिसी डिटेल्स मांगे तो कह देना उनको मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो, हमेशा सेफ रहो जी। Always verify the caller and do not surrender your insurance for attractive offers. हमेशा सावधान रहे, सेफ रहे। Issued in the interest of public awareness by Bajaj Finserv. धोखा है धोखा, धोखा ना खाओ जी। जो होगा
था सो होगा ऐसे ना सोचो जी कॉल पे कोई पूछे ओटीपी दो ना जी
तो कह देना उनको
मिलके स्कैम को एंड करो हमेशा सेफ रहो जी
Being a hero is all about heart. It's not about ruling the world. It's about owning it. It's not about winning a race. It's about delivering a smile to the human race. It's about a spirit that just cannot be confined by geographies. It's about the heart that beats for the future and a soul that echoes the values of generations. And yet, being a hero is never about the hero. It's about the millions who celebrate them. Hero Motorcorp, the motorcycle leader. There's a gush of wind that hums a sweet song. There's a gush of wind that fights like a hero to fill the world with possibility. There's a gush of wind that jumps across oceans and mountains, embracing the entire planet. There's a gush of wind that blows away darkness. There's a gush of wind that blows for humanity. Because at Hero, we care.
In 1868, the Tata Group was founded on a philosophy that put the community at the heart of its existence. Today, we are $100 billion global enterprise. Our today has been built on enduring values. Today is about delivering excellence across business sectors. Today is about building a future-ready nation. Our today has a strong foundation with community at its core. Our today is dedicated to the communities we serve. Today is always about more than just a day. Our today is a continuous journey for a better tomorrow. Tata, leadership with trust.
Behold, the story of victory, of life over malady. Behold the saga of power, of science over sickness. Behold the tale of triumph, of dedication over disease. Behold the rise and rise of Gaddala Pharmaceuticals Limited, one of India's largest privately held pharmaceutical companies based out of Ahmedabad, Gujarat, India. Gaddala Pharmaceuticals was born out of the vision of a legend who left an indelible mark in the chronicles of Indian pharmaceuticals industry. He was Indravadan Ambalal Modi, the founder chairman of the company, rightfully christened as the medicine man of India. His vision to alleviate pain of the underprivileged through research-driven innovations has been driving Gaddala Pharmaceuticals for more than 6 decades now. Innovations which are backed by the key strengths of the company, the state-of-the-art manufacturing and research facilities. The flagship manufacturing facility at Dholka, Gujarat, sprawls over 100 acres. This avant-garde facility is US FDA approved, besides meeting most of the stringent quality standards across the globe. It manufactures tablets, capsules, injectables, liquids, and orals. The second formulations manufacturing facility is located at Samba in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. The API facilities at Ankleshwar, Gujarat, manufacture a large number of key APIs and intermediates at this US FDA and ISO 9002 and ISO 14001 accredited plant. The company also has set up its first ever overseas formulation manufacturing facility at Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. This world-class facility is the only WHO CGMP compliant manufacturing facility in the region. More than 850 products spread across 12 specialties with many of India's top brands in its basket. Great goals are defined by far-sighted vision and achieved by seamless teamwork. A multicultural, multilingual and multinational workforce of over 7,000 employees is truly the propelling power of the company. Not just in the domestic market, the company has a wide global footprint with over 1,000 marketing authorizations across 85 countries. Its international sales force of over 150 highly diversified and versatile personnel lends it an outreach that blankets the globe. As the company grows, so does its commitment to research. Manned by more than 350 scientists, the R&D facilities of Gaddala Pharmaceuticals at Dholka, Gujarat is an institution of breakthrough innovations. To take the focus on innovation to the next level, it partners with leading international companies to discover newer treatments. The Gaddala Pharmaceuticals group is gigantic. Its group companies complement and expand the dynamic vision of the company across new avenues of healthcare and newer fast-paced business areas. Gaddala Pharmaceuticals is a gentle giant. Decades of dedicated research, groundbreaking healthcare innovations, and worldwide impact proves the infinite potential of one powerful emotion. Care. The success of Gaddala Pharmaceuticals bears testimony to the fact that the care continues.
आने वाले कल की दस्तक हमें सुनाई देती है, नई मंजिल है जिस ओर हमें वो दिशा दिखाई देती है। नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए जोश से निकल पड़े हम, आने वाला कल होगा हमारा। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
और नए इंडिया के सफर में टेक्नोलॉजी की शक्ति लेकर आपका भागीदार रहेगा रिलायंस। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
लाइफ में लेना देना तो चलता रहता है। इधर फ्लेक्सी लोन से बोरो कर लिया और उधर बाय मॉम डैड का वेकेशन डन। शादी का डिसीजन लिया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से और बोरो किया। प्रमोशन मिला तो ये लो थोड़ा लोन वापस कर दिया, थैंक यू। नए इंटीरियर्स का दिल किया, फ्लेक्सी लोन से फिर थोड़ा ले लिया। ईयर एंड बोनस मिला तो इस बार लोन ज्यादा वापस कर दिया। लाइफ में लेना देना चलता रहेगा तो लोन्स में क्यों नहीं। इसीलिए फ्लेक्सी लोन फ्रॉम बजाज फिनसर्व एक ऐसा लोन जो जब चाहे बोरो करे, जैसे चाहे रीपे करे, वो भी चुटकी में। थिंक इट डन विद बजाज फिनसर्व।
हेलो, हर सीजन के लिए नए इंटीरियर्स?
हाँ, वो भी हर रूम के लिए।
फ्रिज, स्मार्टफोन या बड़ा टीवी?
तीनों क्यों नहीं?
अरे ये तो शॉपिंग लिस्ट में नहीं था।
सो अब शॉपिंग कार्ट में तो है। सॉरी।
अच्छा, नए आउटफिट्स की विश लिस्ट।
विश क्यों? जस्ट ऐड टू कार्ट एंड बाय।
तो ये सब ईएमआई पे?
और वो भी चुटकी में। On India's fastest growing EMI network. Think it, done with Bajaj Finserv.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट, डन।
माँ के बेडरूम का एसी या लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई, लेटेस्ट मोबाइल फॉर भाई। पुणे, पटना, चेन्नई, मथुरा या फिर बेगूसराय,
या फिर बेगूसराय।
नए घर के लिए चाहिए 4K टीवी हाई फाई या फिर वाई
joining you, and good evening to all colleagues from India.
Yeah, hi,
So-
Ambassador. Just
Morning.
seeing you.
Morning.
Just seeing you. Great to see you, Ambassador. Secretary has joined. Secretary has also joined. Yeah. Yeah. So we are all set, and with your permission, we will begin this very, very important session just on time.
welcome. Go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is joining from all over the world. A very warm welcome to our very, very important and eminent speakers, dignitaries, and delegates joining this session. And this session, as you know, is titled "New Directions of India's FTA Strategy." And ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, this is the 27th Partnership Summit of the CII. It's a great pleasure, privilege, and honor to introduce our esteemed guests of this session, the chief guests, if I can say, of these sessions. We are honored to have with us Mr. BVR Subramaniam, the Secretary, Department of Commerce, Ministry of Commerce and Industry of India. In a very, very short time, relatively, in this most important assignment at this point in time, he has really helped shape a new growth path for India's trade, and has been someone who has been very receptive to industry, which is the main participant in this conference today, the suggestions which have been coming from the industry, and he has been extremely, extremely receptive and extremely collaborative, if I can say. Mr. Secretary, sir, Mr. Subramaniam, a very, very warm welcome to you, and thank you for joining us here today. Let me also extend a very warm welcome to His Excellency Mr. Diego Loza, the Vice Minister of Foreign Trade and Tourism of Peru. Indeed, grateful to you, Honorable Vice Minister, for taking the trouble to join us at, as I was saying, very early morning time of yours. Peru, of course, is a fast emerging, very important trading partner of India in the Latin American region. And India is also negotiating a very comprehensive FTA with Peru, and Indian industry is also looking forward to an early conclusion of that. Trade, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the key tracks of the dialogue in the Partnership Summit, and in fact has been a priority for us right since the inception of this Partnership Summit way back in 1995, when we completed 100 years at CII. And since 1995, the global trade environment has brought many periods of progress and has led the evolution of the new era of globalization. And if we see in the recent years, the world has witnessed a new trend of deglobalization, as there are increasing trends we see of nearshoring and reshoring of manufacturing value chains. And under the influence of the pandemic that we have faced over the last few months, a year or two, a new era in trade seems to be evolving. And for India, trade has emerged as a big growth driver. In fact, in this post-pandemic year, we are likely to see our exports and also our imports at very high levels, very peak levels, with our country, India, pursuing an active export-led economic growth strategy and a US $400 billion export target for the fiscal 2022. It has really placed a very strong and a renewed focus on bilateral as well as regional trade agreements, and it's actively focusing on revamping our FTA strategy. So it's important for India to lay down well-crafted trade agreements for enhanced trade and investment prospects, and also help better calibrate with global supply chains. So given this context, we have this very, very vibrant session with very important keynote speakers, and that will be followed by a discussion after Mr. BVR Subramaniam, the Secretary of Commerce, speaks, and after the Vice Minister, Mr. Diego Loza, gives his address. We will have a panel of very eminent people, Dr. Harshavardhan Singh, who is a former DDG at the WTO, Ajit Ranade of the chief economist at the Aditya Birla Group, and of course, Dr. Rupa Chanda, the Director, Trade and Investment and Innovation Division of the NSCAP that based in Thailand, and Veer Advani, who is the chairman of CII's Committee on Exim. Veer will be chairing and moderating from now in terms of getting this panel to pose some questions to our two very esteemed dignitaries, and then also have a discussion. So over to you, Veer, for taking this session ahead. But before I do that, I'll request our main guests, two main guest speakers, to begin with the keynote by Mr. BVR Subramaniam, Secretary, Department of Commerce, Ministry of Trade and Industry. Over to you, Mr. Secretary, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. I thank CII for giving me this opportunity to address a pretty large audience distributed all over the world. I'd first like to also pay my compliments to His Excellency Mr. Diego Losa, the Vice Minister from Peru, and also the panelists who are going to speak after both of us. Actually, the topic is quite apt, and I noticed this is one of the 9 pillars of the CII's Partnership Summit, which is trade. And I think within that, you've chosen the nice theme of India's FTA strategy, the new direction being given to it. I mean, to begin with, why is trade important and why are exports important? If you look at demand, its composition is made out of 3 components. You have consumption demand, you have investment demand, and you have external demand, which manifests itself in the form of exports. And if you see that, roughly 50 to 60% of demand in India is consumption demand. Depending on what the investment cycle is like, anywhere between 25 to 30% of demand is investment demand. So about 15% in the last decade or so has been what is export demand. So I think export plays a significant role in the total demand composition of the economy. And I think, therefore, there is a need to look at exports more seriously and trade as such overall. If you look at the current situation, the whole world is rebounding from the COVID wave of 2020. Last year was a very bad year globally. I mean, the whole world economy shrank. Most countries, barring a few, actually had a deep recession. Now, if you see and go around the globe, the entire scenario is quite different. The world economy is rebounding, trade is rebounding globally. And if you see the growth rates, we are seeing historically high growth rates in even the developed world. If you actually see what's happening in the developed world and the emerging and developing economies, I mean, the overall growth rates are actually quite close. I mean, this year, the advanced economies are expected to grow at 5.2%, and the emerging market and developing countries are expected to grow at about 6.5%. So it's not too far away, whereas earlier there used to be gaps of 3 to 4% between developed world and the developing world, because there was a lot of catching up. So I actually see this as a phenomenal sign where actually for a change, the developed world with its high growth rates is actually going to become a big consumer of traded goods. And that's visible in the kind of export demand I see. So this is an appropriate time for India actually to plug into global demand, which is growing, to also pull its economy into a faster trajectory. The trade profile of India has been going up and down for the past decade or so. For the last 10, 12 years, Indian exports have actually been hovering $300 billion plus minus 30 billion. So they've been basically fluctuating between 260 billion to about 330 billion. The highest ever exports from India of about 330 billion took place about 3 years ago. And of course, then we have had 2 bad COVID years. But it's actually a story which is worth looking at carefully, that have exports actually fallen off the rails? Has external demand stopped contributing to the same extent to the growth of the Indian economy? So I think, given this scenario, given the size of the Indian economy, its share of the global trade is actually not commensurate. So I think there is a need to push Indian exports to play a larger role internationally and also in pulling up its economy. Now, if you look at how to do that, from a ministry's point of view, what does a ministry do? Ministry actually creates a space for buyers and sellers to trade more. And the actual trade happens largely between private entities. The WTO is supposed to play the primary role in doing this. And that's the multilateral organization which has been set up to do this. And it's delivered a bit. I think 94, when it came up, when the end of the Uruguay round, it was a seminal year, and its outcomes are visible. Most of the world has benefited. Global trade actually boomed for a long time, and India too prospered thanks to WTO. And what you see today is actually what has come out of that. However, having said that, post its creation, after a decade or two, when the initial benefits of the original agreements actually ran through, the WTO has not been able to break into new frontiers. It's not been able to deliver further trade liberalization globally. And I think that's a very big failing, and that's something which has bothered everybody. Now, it's got locked into certain patterns of decision making where it's unable to break through existing, bottlenecks or deadlocks which are there. It is stuck with a consensus decision making process. Two, it's created a certain attitude among negotiators where you take what you have in the past as given and then try to bargain for more. You take agriculture, there's a very inequitable agreement, which was okay in 94, but today if you find it inequitable, there is no way you can actually open it up. You have some other thing somewhere there. They don't even want to look at it. So I think it's got stuck in a kind of a blame game, and it's unable to adjust to new realities. It has not been able to do much of services liberalization. And if you look at the world, it's the service sector which is growing much faster than any other sector. You go to the WTO, they're unwilling to unwind agriculture, which is far more important for developing countries because they've got what they wanted then. So I'm not saying that's the good thing. We are all trying to struggle and bring the WTO back to track. India is an active investor in the success of the multilateral system. But somehow if it is not able to deliver, we have to look at our own paths. Having said that, the important thing is India is not the only country which is feeling this. Most developing countries, and most surprisingly, most developed countries have actually now started looking outside the WTO. And by doing so, what is the only other option available to them? The two options are either you enter into bilateral free trade agreements or you get into regional trading agreements. So the kind of tariff concessions or the liberalization in services or other areas that you were expecting from the WTO, you're now trying to gain through systems outside the WTO. Hence, you see the FTAs coming up as an alternate to the WTO. From a handful of FTAs, there is a boom in the number of FTAs in the world. There are 2,000 plus free trade agreements in the world. Now, this is not necessarily the best scenario, because what happens is, depending on where a particular product is coming from, there's a lot of administrative costs that gets loaded onto determining what applicable tariff is there, but it's the second best. And I think the whole world has plugged onto it. Many countries have moved aggressively, and I think, therefore, it's time for India, and that was what was felt, both in commerce as well as the government, that we should also ride on to the FTA strategy. It's an important point to note that India is the only major economy in the world, and I re-emphasize, the only major economy which has not signed into any large, either a regional trading agreement or major agreements with large economies. I think that's an important point to note. Every other major economy is locked into some kind of a regional or a bilateral arrangement. EU in itself is an FTA, and it's a customs union and a free trade area, and they're having their own bilateral agreements around the world, more than 30 of them. The United States has got, in spite of all its difficulties, the old NAFTA with a new name is still there. In our neighborhood, we have RCEP, which we didn't join for very, very valid reasons and concerns. You have the CPTPP, the original TPP, which the US was planning to join but withdrew, but the rest of the countries went through. But bilaterally, almost everybody has gone into FTAs very, very aggressively. And the consequence of that is India was getting shut out of major markets. It's getting a lot of, tariff disadvantages in major markets. You go to the UK, Vietnam has a tariff advantage compared to India. Parts of Southeast Asia have tariff benefits compared to India. Bangladesh has benefits. So if you see at the major exporting sectors of India, textiles, leathers, garments, all of them actually suffer tariff disadvantages. Therefore, with that in mind, keeping market access on an equitable basis, we have actually focused on breaking into FTAs with many, many more countries. We are looking at market access now and also market access in the future. The core focus is 2-3. A, remove tariff disadvantages. And mind you, they're significant. When margins are thin, even a 10% tariff disadvantage can make all the difference. 2, go for existing markets, go for new markets. 3, go for existing products and go for new products. And lastly, and this is very important, look at lost market share. And that's something we have seen. Take gems and jewelry, for example. Our peak exports were 40 billion about 5-7 years ago. They were less than 30 billion 2 years ago. So actually we were dominant somewhere and we have lost market share. You go sector after sector, commodity group after commodity group, and you will start realizing there was big Indian presence and then we have shrunk. So we have looked at all this and come out with this strategy to go into FTAs on a big scale. What are the FTAs we are currently negotiating? In the Middle East, we have one with the UAE, which we are about to conclude any day. I'm saying day, I'm not even saying weeks. And that's something which we did very rapidly. Launched on 22nd of September, and we are not yet 22nd December, and we're almost done. We'll have the signing sometime in January or so, hopefully, God willing. We are also going to launch one with Israel, relaunch negotiations which were stuck with Israel. So we'll have that also by March, April in place. We are negotiating an FTA with Australia. We'll have an interim in place by end of this month, and we'll have a full agreement by next year. We are doing an agreement with UK. We'll have an interim in place by March, April, and a final by December. EU agreement, which has been stalled for about 7 years, we have restarted, and hopefully in about a year and a half, it's a more complex dynamic there, many countries, 27 countries. We'll have that somewhere by mid-23. We are negotiating one with the Eurasian Economic Union, that's Russia plus 3 countries. And again, by end of next year, hopefully we'll have an agreement. We're discussing with Canada. And hopefully by end of next year, we'll have a full-fledged agreement. So if you see the pattern of agreements, they're quite different from our pattern in the past. In the past, we had FTAs with our neighborhood, which is basically SAFTA, and 1 or 2 here and there, Singapore, etc. Now we are actually going in for advanced economies, economies whose economy by and large is complementary to the Indian system, Indian product line, and therefore in the short run, there'll be benefits. And as our economies evolve, there'll be a lot of give and take. As far as the United States is concerned, they have not yet finalized their approach to trade policy. So I think it's on hold, but I think we had a US trade policy forum recently in which the last sentence was very important, which says we intend to take our trade relationship to the next higher level. In diplomatic words, that's code word for that we'll be working towards something which more concrete in the near future. Just 1 or 2 points now to conclude. Most trade FTAs can't be one way. Everybody wants market access elsewhere. The other side would like to have market access in your country. So there has to be give and take. And that's something which I want the industry who is listening to whatever we are saying to keep in mind. There has to be some give. To make an FTA actually realistic and also compliant with, say, WTO norms, we need to have at least 90% of trade covered under substantial liberalization. So it is not that we pick and choose what we want, do some cherry picking and leave the rest. So it will be quite deep integration of economies. There will be some sensitive lines. I know, for example, in an Indian context, dairy is a very sensitive area. So probably we'll be careful about 1 or 2. But by and large, these are going to be very deep FTAs. The second thing to note, when you're negotiating FTAs with advanced economies, I call them new generation FTAs. FTAs began with goods, then they went to services and investment. And of course, they'll have a few provisions like, TBTs and, sanitary and phytosanitary barriers, technical barriers to trade, rules of origin. The new generation FTAs will have a lot of new things. They'll have stuff like environment, geographical indicators, intellectual property rights, social issues like labor, gender, environment, and it'll go on, MSMEs. So this is actually a whole new bunch of areas which are neither there in WTO or nor there in earlier FTAs. So as we go there, we are actually, if you look at our chapters, we are negotiating with some of the advanced countries. We are talking of 16 to 18 chapters. Half of them we won't touch in the WTO. but we are actually doing bilaterally with the EU, UK, Australia. In Australia, one of the chapters is going to be on logistics. We are talking digital, e-commerce. So these FTAs will be new. What does it mean for Indian industry? A, the good news is there'll be tremendous access to new markets. They will lose a lot of tariff disadvantages they suffer from. There'll be a lot of non-tariff barriers which will go away. The FTA with UAE, I don't want to say that, will open up huge avenues for our pharma sector. But on the other side, you're opening up your markets. So I think industry will have to realize that competition will increase. There is no giveaway. There'll be more competition. Protectionist barriers will come down to a significant extent. If they're not happening multilaterally, they'll happen bilaterally. Therefore, to survive, industry will have to focus on, number one, value addition. They'll have to have high value addition. Two, they will have to move up the value chain. You cannot be selling low value products which are very low in the value chain. They will have to move up the value chain. They will have to focus on quality and excellence. Only by so focusing can you move up the value chain. They will have to go for branding. I mean, after all, when you buy a television, you think of a Sony, a mobile phone, you think of an Apple, Samsung. If you have to break into the markets we are opening, they will have to actually have branding and marketing on a significant scale. They should also have a constant eye on markets. Your domestic market is not going to be secure, and you will have to win foreign markets. So companies will have to adjust to this new dynamic. More importantly, Indian companies have to become members of global value chains, global supply chains. And that's a very important thing. Countries do not want to be restricted today to single source suppliers. So they would like to actually diversify their supplies. And for that, our country has to position itself, which means our companies have to position themselves. We will do all we can from government to reduce barriers to becoming part of these value chains, simplifying processes, reducing the paperwork, etc. But finally, it's the companies which will have to take advantage of this. And lastly, companies will have to have active market orientation. They should develop solid market intelligence. I think as we sign these FTAs, there'll be more and more private entrepreneurs who will probably come up, probably even some startups will sell a lot of market data to companies so that they can actually break into foreign markets. I would request every Indian company which is listening or otherwise, think global. Don't look at an Indian market which is so many billion. Look at the global market now as we open up these markets. The government is, of course, going to be very supportive. We are doing a number of things apart from the FTAs. We are restructuring the entire commerce department. You will see those results from March, April, May, June. We will have trade promotion as a major thing. Our embassies, whom our Prime Minister addressed on 6th of August, are taking keen interest, and the impact is visible. Our companies are saying now they get replies from embassies within 24 hours. We will strengthen the trade wing of every embassy because that's going to be the primary function which is expected of embassies. So there are a lot of initiatives we are doing. We are revamping the legal framework within which our SEZs and the DGFT function. All this will be unrolling by March, April, May next year. But given all this, I think India is reaching out to the world more confident of itself, confident in its capabilities, confident in its capacities to supply the world, and confident to meet the world on its own terms as an equal partner. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Subramaniam. That was, as usual, yours most informative, very, very insightful, clearly explaining the vision of India, your vision, I can say, and also really explaining India's position so very clearly to the industry, to the world. And if I may say, you have really helped us not set the agenda for this particular session, but given us a complete agenda and a huge amount of ideas and work to do from the industry, given what you have said. So this is really sets it, and really, really grateful for taking pains for being with us to say this much. I'll request you to please stay on because I'm sure the eminent panel that you have will have a couple of questions for you. And so thank you very much once again. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure now to move to His Excellency, Mr. Diego Los, the Vice Minister of Foreign Trade of the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Tourism, Peru.
So much, Mr. Banerjee. And first of all, I would like to thank the Ministry of Commerce and Industry of the Government of India, and the Confederation of Indian Industry, CCI, for the invitation to participate in the CCI Partnership Summit. Please allow me to express our sincere appreciation and send warm greetings from Mr. Roberto Sanchez, our Minister of Trade and Tourism of Peru. For me, it's a real honor to be here with you today in this important session, representing the Ministry of Trade and Tourism of Peru, and to share the floor with you, Mr. Banerjee, from the Confederation of Indian Industry, with Minister Secretary Subramaniam, Secretary of the Department of Commerce, and the group of distinguished panelists. Peru considers that India's free trade agreement strategy and its open trade policy, as presented by Mr. Subramaniam, are very positive and will allow India to compete on a global scale, opening up new markets for Indian products and services, delivering opportunities for businesses, especially for medium and small-sized businesses, to benefit from greater trade and investment opportunities, but beyond that, to integrate into global and regional value chains. Free trade agreements benefit Indian exporters, importers, producers, investors, and its population as a whole. In this opportunity, I would like to share with you some information on Peru's foreign trade strategy, including our experience negotiating preferential trade agreements and our current negotiation for a free trade agreement with India, which for us is of the utmost importance. Peru, for more than 25 years, has maintained a trade policy based on the principles of openness and trade liberalization, with a view to facilitating our country's insertion in international markets and its participation in global value chains, in order to promote economic growth and increase the well-being and development of our population. Indeed, Peru has developed a trade policy based on the National Strategic Export Plan, which was updated until 2025. This plan has three objectives: enabling local companies to go international, increasing diversified exports, and enhancing competitiveness. These efforts are in line with the policy tools implemented over the past decades, such as unilateral tariff liberalization, international trade negotiation, and domestic competitiveness and facilitation policies related to foreign trade. This has led the country to positive results in terms of trade and investment in recent years. In terms of goods, total trade increased from $14 billion in 2000 to $86 billion in 2019, before the COVID-19 pandemic. Likewise, our exports have grown by an annual average of 9% since 2000, highlighting non-traditional exports that generate greater value, diversification, employment, and capacity building of our SMEs. Complementary to trade policy, the Peruvian institutional framework favors private investment, both domestic and foreign investment, with a stable and predictable legal framework for the promotion and protection of investment and mechanisms to incorporate private investment in the development of public infrastructure projects and services. As a result, the stock of registered foreign direct investment amounted to $28 billion at the end of 2020, which mainly includes investments in the mining, communications, finance, energy, and industry sectors. This trade opening and integration of Peru to the world is due to a great extent to the negotiation of trade agreements. In particular, Peru has an extensive network totaling 22 FTAs in force, with more than 50 countries in America, Europe, Asia, and Oceania. Among Peru's most important trade partners with a trade agreement are China, the United States, and the European Union. It is now further consolidated in the Asia-Pacific region with the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. For Peru, this agreement entered into force in September, after the ratification by the Congress in July. This agreement, the CPTPP, expanded Peru's network of bilateral trading partners to include countries such as New Zealand, Brunei Darussalam, Vietnam, and Malaysia, and preference agreed with countries with whom bilateral agreements already existed were also taken further. There is a case for Japan, Canada, and Mexico. In this way, we have preferential access to 83% of the world GDP and 43% of the population. This is what represents for us our network of FTAs. In 2021, 91% of our exports goes to countries covered by trade agreements, while in 2006, it barely reached 80%. And similarly to the experience of India, 15, 20 years ago, we mainly negotiated agreements with our neighbors. And then after the negotiation of the free trade agreement with the US, we opened our strategy of negotiation to every part of the world. In other words, the FTAs are fundamental in allowing the entry and consolidation of Peruvian products and services to other markets. Peru maintains an active negotiating agenda. We are currently negotiating a trade agreement with India, with Nicaragua. We are optimizing our trade agreement with China. At the same time, under the framework of the Pacific Alliance with Colombia, Mexico, and Chile, Peru has concluded negotiation with Singapore as an associate member of the Pacific Alliance and is negotiating with other countries in that framework. Peru is a small, open country, but it's also a very active member of the World Trade Organization. Of course, for us, the World Trade Organization is the umbrella under which we have negotiated our FTAs. And our FTAs comply with the standards that the WTO requires in terms of coverage of goods and services liberalization under an FTA. But beyond that, we also participate in different initiatives under the WTO. In fact, we are part of the Domestic Regulation Initiative, which seeks to facilitate trading services, also the discussions and negotiations on e-commerce. And also, this means that Peru's strategy includes continuing to actively participate at the multilateral level. There are certain issues that cannot be dealt under an FTA that has to be discussed under the WTO. Now let me give some ideas regarding our FTA negotiation between Peru and India. I said that it's a priority on Peru's trade agenda. India is Peru's fourth trading partner in Asia after China, Korea, and Japan, and is the 10th in the world. We consider that this agreement could strengthen our country's economic and commercial relations. Bilateral trade between India and Peru has grown consistently through the years. In 2010, bilateral trade was around $700 million US, and in 2018, it reached a peak surpassing $3 billion US. The Peru-India FTA seeks to be a modern and ambitious agreement that will cover trading goods and trading services, movement on people and investment. An ambitious agreement with all the areas that the Secretary mentioned in his intervention. For instance, among the benefits of a trade agreement between Peru and India is that we will both benefit with preferential tariffs to improve market access for our goods. Currently, bilateral trade is largely made up of minerals, but there is a lot of room to grow, expand, and diversify. For example, we hope this FTA will promote export growth to India in sectors such as agriculture, where we are currently gaining participation with products including fresh avocados, Brazilian nuts, grapes, blueberries, among others. Likewise, this agreement will establish conditions that will allow for a free trade in services between both countries. We know how competitive India is in trading services. We hope to boost trading services and attract Indian investment to Peru and vice versa. There are significant opportunities for sectors such as solar energy, software, cinema, gastronomy, among other sectors. Trade negotiations with India started in 2017, and up to now, 5 rounds of negotiation have been held, the last one in August 2019. However, due to the health situation generated by COVID-19 pandemic, our 6th round of negotiation had to be postponed. From the Peruvian side, we would like to reaffirm our interest in this FTA with India, and therefore our commitment to this negotiation process. We hope we can resume our work as soon as possible and celebrate a virtual round in the next year of the first semester. We strongly believe that the current economic and commercial relations and those that will be generated from a trade agreement with Peru and India will strengthen our strategic partnership and position in the region and will generate economic and sustainable growth that will benefit both countries. We have experienced that due to the negotiation with other trade partners, and we would like the same for the relationship between Peru and India. Moreover, this FTA will help our micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, which are crucial for the economic post-pandemic recovery of our nations, and also to generate employment and promote inclusive, sustainable development. Trade is a key part in the economic development of Peru. Trade negotiation of FTAs has been a tool that we have used for the purpose of inclusiveness in an integration into international markets. And we hope to continue growing globally with higher participation in the global markets. And we think that we can create more opportunities with a closer relationship with India, promoting more linkages between our business sectors. With this, I conclude my intervention, thanking once again for the invitation.
Thank you so much to both the speakers. That was really fascinating. If you allow me, I'll just walk through some of the highlights. I have a couple of questions, and then I thought I'd request each of our panel members to give a short comment and, of course, to focus on the questions. Mr. Subramaniam, thank you for you gave a wonderful history of what has happened leading up to now. I think you gave us a glimpse of what we perhaps didn't do right the last time when we had signed 3 or 4 or 5 of those FTAs. I agree with you that this is the right time for us to plug into this global demand that has resurged, and it really is an opportunity for Indian companies to participate. And I think that clearly our share of global trade is not adequate, and it's an opportunity for us. The element of WTO's effectiveness and therefore us stepping up to address some of those challenges is indeed, it's very encouraging for us as Indian industry because, with you leading the charge, we're confident that we will be brought into that global trade. I think in terms of the goals for the FTA, removing tariff disadvantages, going after existing markets, more excitedly going after new markets and new products, and of course, regaining our market share in some of our mainstays. I think these are all perfect goals that you have listed out. I'm sure in these negotiations, we will see the fruits of all your labor. From Indian industry perspective, I think you've rightly highlighted that these are two-way trade agreements, which means that we must be open to opening our markets and our economy. And therefore, Indian industry needs to step up to be able to compete with companies coming in from these developed markets, because obviously these are not regional agreements, but these are now global advanced and developed country agreements. And the new idea you brought in that there is a new economy, the digital economy, and how we can cover that as part of these FTAs. I think that will make it a little challenging, but I think also exciting for our unicorns as we move forward. So thank you for those remarks. And Mr. Losa, I was not aware of the amount of work that Peru has done in global trade, in developing new FTAs, 22 new FTAs with 50 countries, covering, you said, about 80% of the global economy. I think you made the point that what Mr. Subramaniam made, that it was only after you all looked beyond your neighborhood that you realized that there was this kind of opportunity. So that's a big learning for us as a country, and we appear to be on the right path. You did highlight that WTO compliance is something that you'll focus on in spite of having the FTAs in place, and you figured out a way to leverage both sides of this. So that is, again, encouraging. The numbers, of course, were astounding, and I won't repeat them. It is also exciting to see that Peru is keen to have this India agreement in place. $3 billion of trade is, of course, substantial, but I'm sure there's a lot more opportunity that we have both ways. And you did list agri products and, of course, services that India is strong in, but I'm sure Peru has a number of products to offer as well. So I think I think the audience got a gist of what both of you are saying, and I think I'd almost say that they're parallel and in some ways in the right and same direction. So with that, if I can just pose a couple of questions to each of you, and then I'll ask my panelists to come in as well. So Mr. Subramaniam, to you first. You did mention the UAE agreement and Australia, Canada, and the UK. I had a question on the EU agreement, because I understand that that is a comprehensive agreement that covers services, investment, goods, and people. And I know that that is a really challenging one and a difficult one. So some thoughts and inputs from you on how the Indian government is looking at the EU agreement in particular, and how long you expect it would take, and what your view is on putting it together. Over to you.
Thank you for the question. You're right. The EU agreement is a complex one, but the complexity is not in terms of what is in the agreement. If you look at the UK agreement, which we are negotiating, and we are negotiating on a pretty fast track, and there's a lot of convergence, we are discussing things which are extremely wide, and they're all there in the EU agreement as well. So what you can do with the UK, you can do with the EU as well. The bigger problem or challenge with the EU is the EU is a complex entity. So getting consensus among 27 members is actually the cause of the delay. As a market, the EU is actually as big as the United States. So, therefore, it's very important. While the UK one, we'll have the interim one by, say, April, May, and the main one, the full agreement, by December. The EU one will be there in place by about mid-2023, because the negotiating process with EU tends to be slow. So what you do on a monthly basis with UK and almost on a fortnightly basis with UAE, you do on a 2 or 3 monthly basis with the EU. You do some negotiations, go back, they discuss with all their member states, come back. So that's the only reason. 2, you must understand that significant progress was made with the EU when they actually had negotiations for 6-7 years. Then it got stuck on a few issues. I mean, the issues are known: cars and, wine and, whiskey is anyway now out of EU, it's with UK, and, a couple of such things. But I'm sure, since we all know the pain points, we actually have a starting point which is not at zero. You're starting with a handicap. So you're actually starting quite ahead. So I'm very confident that by about the first half of 23, the EU will be through. And just to supplement what the Vice Minister from Peru has said, South America, Mercosur, Peru are also very high up on our agenda. My colleagues in the ministry are also talking, and we'll be fast tracking them, and 22 will also see a lot of stuff there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. One more question to you, and then I'll go to our guest, our second guest. This is about, this is slightly larger than FTAs. This is to do with India integrating into global value chains. I know the Honorable Prime Minister has also emphasized this on his in his address on exports in August last year. And I know the Department of Commerce, of course, is working hard on this front. You are aware that integration into GVCs is a more complex exercise. It requires simultaneously addressing various issues, such as supportive trade policy, robust quality infrastructure, very efficient trade logistics, efficiency in services sector. Only when all of these come together can we really integrate into these value chains. So what is, how do you see our roadmap as far as India is concerned and our aim to integrate into these GVCs so that we can get a larger share of exports from this?
Yeah, I mean, that you need to be part of global value chain is understood. And I think it's being spoken all the way from the Prime Minister downwards to anybody who matters in the trade arena. The bigger issue is, I mean, you're not creating a new supply chain. Global value chains already exist. It's a question of supply chains shifting from one location. So when they shift, they're going to actually consider alternatives. And when the alternatives are there, they're going to look at pain points. They're going to look at how difficult is this shift going to be? What are all the things that are going to change because of this shift? And I think that's what we need to focus on. You mentioned some. You mentioned logistics as an issue. So you've seen the Prime Minister announce Gati Shakti. The idea is to reduce logistics costs. However, mind you, logistics per se need not be a disadvantage for a coast-based supply point. So coast-based actually resolves a lot of things. So, and India has a very long coastline, and with about 15 odd states and union territories. So that's one part. The second part is, and I think this is important, it's the tariffs. Just shifting a value chain, you may say we do not tax exports. But the very fact that you tax them inwards and then refund the taxes outwards is a cost point. It's a cost center. Companies don't like it. 3, and this is even more important, much more than either tariff, which people are happy to be refunded with at a point of time. It's the procedural hassles. When I go to an SEZ, today there are no tax benefits for being inside an SEZ. So you go to an SEZ, say Brandix in Vizag, and ask them, I mean, what's the advantage of being in an SEZ? You ask a pharma chap, Laurus Labs, why are you in an SEZ? They have plants both inside and outside. He said, if you want to make a pure international play, it's far less of a nuisance to be inside an SEZ. There's very little paperwork, my stuff comes in easily, my stuff goes out easily. I think that should be the goal of the government. We should be looking not just at ease of doing business, we should actually be looking at cost of doing business. And cost includes cost of working capital, capital stuck in logistics, capital stuck because of paperwork being complex or handling that. And I think we are working on that. We see a bright future. When we are discussing these FTAs, we are not only looking at FTAs per se, there's going to be a lot of investment happening bilaterally. I do not want to preempt these things as they will come out, but I actually see a lot of industrial and manufacturing growth happening around some hubs, which will be focused on value chain. I think the government should be and will be working on developing global value chain oriented industrial hubs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Mr. Losa, if I can come over to you now, sort of similar questions, but more your experience. You mentioned that you saw that FDI, foreign direct investment, went up considerably in Peru after this. I wanted to ask you, what were the implications on the SMEs in your country? Because India has a large number of SMEs, and I know there's some amount of hesitation and doubt in the SME sector about opening up our domestic economy. So just some feedback and thoughts you have on that, your experience.
Thank you so much, Mr. Advani. And this is a very interesting question because in Peru, as it is the case of most countries, SMEs play a key role in the creation of jobs. It's 99% of our companies are SMEs. And in terms of exports, SMEs are around 75% in terms of numbers of companies, but it just represents in value 5% in export value. So we have this challenge in how we can expand the base of exporters, including more SMEs in this process, and let them grow in the process. Many of the sectors that has had a huge growth in the last years are made of SMEs. Agricultural exporters are mainly SMEs. Textile and apparel exporters are SMEs. In other sectors, that's the same case. Most of the big companies are those related with mining sector. And of course, there was a hesitation 10 years, 15 years ago. We were negotiating agreements with our main trading partners. Mainly, if we talk about the negotiation with the FTA, there was a huge process of raising awareness of the importance of opening up our market and how we have to make reforms domestically so we can become more competitive and our SMEs more competitive in trading goods and in trading services, and help them to go through the process of internationalization. We have an agency for trade promotion from Peru that has a series of programs that help SMEs to go through the process of internationalization. Also trying to help them to get access to finance tools, so they can they can fund the process of their export market plans. In this sense, of course, also there was some sectors that were reluctant to the negotiation of FTAs. For example, one of them is the textile sector, but we have helped them also to go through the internationalization process. It doesn't mean that this issue has ended. Indeed, has posed us the challenge to continue working. And this strategic export plan is mainly a focus on the internationalization of our SMEs and make them integrate themselves into the global value chains, into the regional value chains. It's not an easy task, but we are in this process. Also, I have to mention that for the current government, it's a high priority to help, especially the most vulnerable ones, to realize how trade openness can benefit them. And in that sense, we work with SMEs, with Association of Agricultural Producers, with enterprises owned by women or led by women, among other sectors that we think we need to close the gaps that does not allow them to fully benefit of trade openness.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If I can request Dr. Harsha Vardhana Singh, former Deputy Director General, World Trade Organization, to please, if you can just share some thoughts, and more importantly, if you can ask any questions or that you have to the speakers.
Thank you very much. This has been very exciting. So first of all, thanks to CII, Mr. Banerjee and Mr. Advani. I've greeted everyone else. Mr. Subramaniam, I haven't greeted you, so greetings, and delighted to hear your thoughts. The interesting thing is that Mr. Diego Leusa, it was very, very good to hear from you also. I have a few thoughts and some questions to both the keynote speakers. One, Mr. Subramaniam very correctly pointed out the key policy changes. He also emphasized a need for reorientation for the domestic industry to engage in a more substantive manner in a new emerging economy. And you also talked about policies change, perhaps leading to a faster conclusion of the FTAs. In the past, we have been negotiating FTAs for quite some time. With Australia, we did it. With EU, we negotiated for quite some time. So these new kind of timelines, is it that not only the policy changes you talked about, because the policy changes are efficiency enhancing changes in general, plus in the FTA context, what is the change in the strategy given the larger basis of the FTA, especially EU? And you said with US, UK, you're going very, very rapidly. That will enable the conclusion much faster now, because there must be something of a change compared to the previous position or engagement. Second, you very correctly pointed out that tariffs can be a blockage in the context of both global value chains as well as integrating with the world markets. Tariffs actually tend to orient production towards domestic markets rather than the global markets. And GVCs and tariffs have, especially for inputs, becomes a complex phenomena. There is also an emphasis on local content. And in terms of policy, WTO actually rules out providing incentives on grounds of local content, etc. So there is a much larger change than just trade policy changes, which need to be considered for an integration of the Indian producers into global value chains with higher value addition. Likewise, we have seen, and this is something where some of the work we have done in the last 2-3 years, a lot of very good policies are announced, but the monitoring to see whether effectively they are implemented on the ground so that the anticipated benefit is passing on, there is a weakness in that part. So what is the process which is envisaged to interact with industry to ensure that the policies which Mr. Loza, you pointed out that you're also changing policies at home, but what are the processes which are being put together? Because you talk to the industry a lot, but what is the nature of follow-up program? What is the coordination? Because a global value chain is not only one sector. It has to be a multi-sector coordination effort. So those are the kind of things which perhaps will give substance to all these efforts. Further, most countries which have actually succeeded have focused on scale. And scale requires looking at certain specific features of policy. So I would request that this feature become a more integrated part of the policy framework, because the nature of policies you develop for scale are very different sometimes from just efficiency per se. There are two types of FTA efforts. One was started by the US during the Trump administration, where they started negotiating smaller kind of agreements of early harvest. The other is the kind you're negotiating with EU, etc., which is a more comprehensive FTA. Is the kind of thing you negotiated in CPTPP, for example. Is it possible to also, and you had Mr. Subramaniam, you had a very good meeting in the Trade Policy Forum from the reports I've read with the US. Is it possible to activate those kind of initiatives with other countries? Because you don't necessarily have to negotiate FTAs with all these countries. You have to create opportunities for Indian business. And is it possible to really take a second line, which is not a full-fledged FTA, but something like Mr. Trump's FTAs, where you focus on regulations, you focus on market access in agriculture, in some of the products, and for certain important products like automotive products, etc. The kind of countries which were mentioned, they are very different from the countries which are being covered under our FTA initiative. So that is another thought which I have. And in that context, I also want to now try and see with Mr. Loza, what you said that you are negotiating trade agreement with China. And Mr. Subramaniam talked about complementarity of countries. And China obviously is seen as, for India, not a complementary country. What are you doing in order to address the complications which might arise if you open up your economy to China? What is it that you're doing? And in the context of GVCs, what have you put on the ground which actually ensures the fact that your companies are going to integrate much more quickly and substantively in those GVCs. For Mr. Subramaniam, one last point I'll make, which is that in addition to, and this is linked to implementation aspects, we focus very much on improving efficiency, on indices, where India stands in terms of various international indices. But when we are competing in the global economy, we are actually competing against certain few countries. So my thought in this is that let us create a smaller indice base where we compare ourselves with our competing economies and try and see where are we behind whom and which are the areas which we need to focus on immediately. Because there are, say, 10 or 20 areas the government needs to look at, which are the priority areas where either the gap is too much or whether the impact will be largest. So these are some of the thoughts, but I'm really impressed by what is happening. And I wish you all success, because that will really change the face of India. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsha. Mr. Subramaniam, if you can go first. Many questions, but I'll let you decide what all you can answer, and then Mr. Losa after that.
Yeah, okay. I'll answer all of them, as many as I can quickly. Number one, he asked, how are these timelines being met in terms of negotiating? Because we have had a history. India is considered a tough negotiator, and we have negotiated some agreements for decades. I mean, the U1 is going on for 15 years. We have changed strategy. We have created crack teams within commerce, and we're taking them all up sequentially. So if you see the deadline, I actually have a PERT chart like you do for a construction project. Which agreement is at what stage and when is it getting completed? So there is actually allocation of resource. Two, India was not a great FTA country 15 years ago. It was actually a WTO-focused country. So actually the Commerce Ministry never created an FTA negotiating wing within itself. The Commerce had a trade policy which looked after WTO, and it had territorial divisions which looked at little, apples and oranges and mangoes and, bananas kind of stuff with different countries. When FTA started coming up, each officer looking after those particular countries was handed over the task of FTA, but they were not trained in negotiations. They didn't have people below them who actually were negotiators. And negotiating is a different tactic, and actually doing day-to-day trade-related stuff, opening markets, things stuck at some port, they're a different set of things. So I think that's the first thing. We have created two trade policy wings within commerce. There's one multilateral and one bilateral. A lot of countries have it. UK has it, US has it, everybody. Two, there are individuals who head that, and there are crack teams below that. That's one. Two, as we restructure commerce, as I said, I've got a big consultant who's finishing their work mid-January. By March, when you see that, you'll not be able to recognize this department 6 months from now. Most countries have a huge trade promotion wing. Actually, India doesn't have a trade promotion thing. DGFT sees itself as an incentive distributing office. So the DGFT is also about, it came out of an act which is called Foreign Trade Development and Regulation. Where is the development part? Completely forgotten. It became a regulator. So we are doing that. We are restructuring the departments. The point you said about making for world markets, it's important from another reason. It bumps up quality like nobody's business. When you learn to make for the global market, it improves your quality domestically also. Our car market, automobile market is a good example. They make for the world. They also do well by making better products for India. You also need to bump up local standards. Don't lower them to the last guy here. You bump up your automobile standards, you make better automobiles, which actually then sell in the rest of the world. So I think that's one important reason. And I think that's what the Prime Minister's mantra has been, local goes global, make in India for the world. I mean, and I think it's a good thing to remember. Make in India for the world by making local go global. You mentioned the issue about larger policy changes. You're absolutely right. Trade policy doesn't sit in a silo on itself. When we went out with a new revamped trade policy, I came in the month of July. In the end of July, we made a presentation to all the ministers who mattered on a foreign trade policy on FTAs. The finance minister, commerce minister, the external affairs minister, everybody. There are strategic reasons. Israel is important strategically, not necessarily as an economy. So there is a buy-in from many levels on, and countries and regions were, selected and prioritized accordingly, And that's why I think you will see as we go along, wait for the next budget. There are going to be a lot of trade-related packages coming up in the budget. For the first time, you'll find specific paras addressing us. So I think that's important. So we have brought harmony there. And, the old history of, we wanting something, finance not doing is no longer there. So I think that's important. There are, of course, many other issues. Skill you mentioned. There are a lot of supply side things that need to be done. But I think we're taking steps. Take two areas I'll mention. Take gems and jewelry. There is no department in Government of India which owns up gems and jewelry as theirs. There is none. Automobiles as heavy industry, pharma as a ministry. Who looks at India's third biggest export is actually gems and jewelry. So actually we have adopted that. Take services as a sector. Services are not anybody's baby in the government today. Nobody's baby. So we have created a separate division on services exports and commerce, not services negotiations. And come January or so, we'll come back to CII, we'll probably do something on services, and we'll give a special emphasis to services. Currently, services exports are happening autonomously. It's good because it's good, not because we did much. So I think we need to focus on that. And I think once you do agreements in services, there's a need to sensitize the markets. Look, we have opened up new markets for you in services. Why don't you actually take advantage? It's no longer mode 4. It's about actually delivering services across borders, business establishment. The US agreements, and I will end there, actually a lot of the Trump era agreements were not free trade agreements. They were actually bilateral agreements. If there were some tariff concessions, it was to be MFN. So actually you don't benefit. So actually if India enters into an agreement with the US, the benefit may not go to US, it may go to some other country. That's one part. And the second, a lot of them will not stand the test of WTO. It is more of what used to be in ministerial statements entering into so-called agreements, but they're not legal agreements or anything of that sort. So I think that's very important to note. But I think we have noted your points, and I think they're valuable suggestions.
Thank you. Mr. Losa, please.
Thank you. There was a question about our experience with the negotiation with China and the complementarity between both countries. The agreement with China, the Peru-China FTA is in place for 11 years, and it has been quite successful in terms of what China is right now for Peru as a trading partner. China has become the first trade partner for Peru. Almost 1/3 of trading goods, exports and imports are sourced or goes to China. And we have a superávit in our trade balance with China, based mainly on the exports of mining goods and fisheries goods. Around 90% of our exports to China are mining goods, and the other is fishing goods. And in terms of imports, it's mainly machinery, vehicles, and equipment. Almost half of our imports from China are machinery, vehicles, and equipment. We see a lot of complementarities, and indeed, China is almost half of our exports on mining goes to China, and almost half of our exports on fishing goods goes to China. Our main challenge is how we can diversify that growth, not only in these two sectors, but also in others that could create more impact in the domestic, in Peru. And one of them is, for example, agro exports. It has been growing in the last years. It has been continuing growing. It's grown in 2020. It reached a record of $180 million. It has been continuing growing in 2021. There is a lot of work that we have to develop with China in terms of making progress in non-tariff measures, especially sanitary and phytosanitary measures, both for fishing goods, but also for agricultural goods. There is a work that is currently being done by our sanitary authorities for new market access, sanitary market access protocols, so we can have more goods exported to China. There is a huge potential if we see what China imports annually in terms of, for example, agricultural goods. The participation of Peru is quite small. It's no more than 3% of what China imports. And there is a potential in goods such as grapes, avocados, blueberries, coffee, cocoa, among others. The second issue that was raised was related with our integration into supply chains, to global supply chains. I think that in general, Latin America has a challenge because when we have discussions about global value chains, we tend to talk about these global factories, and there are regions that has developed these global factories in Asia, in Europe, in North America, but there is no development of a global factory in South America, and which country could have the role of becoming the hub of that global factory, which could be Mexico or could be Brazil, but still they don't play that role so far. In that case, for Peru, part of the strategy has been the negotiation of FTAs, but the other part of the strategy is working domestically in the development of competitiveness of our producers so they can offer more value-added goods and also have a higher share on all the value chain in terms of the services that are included in our goods, the amount of innovation and technology that is embodied into those goods, so we can have a higher portion or share in terms of what we could obtain from our participation in global value chains, which is still very low, and there is a challenge for Peru and in general for South America how we can achieve a greater participation in global value chains.
Thank you very much. If I can now request I'll request both Dr. Ajit Ranade as well as Dr. Rupa Chanda, if you can go one after the other, some comments and any questions that you may have, and then I'll request the two speakers to maybe answer, both of you together, if that's all right. So Ajit, over to you first.
Thank you, Mr. Veeradvani, and thanks to CII for inviting, and greetings to all of you. First of all, I'd like to compliment Secretary Subramaniam about the export performance of India this year. I think we are on track to reach $400 billion of exports of goods and just goods alone, and it's something like a 37 or 40% increase from last year, despite the low base of the pandemic. So I think this is really outstanding, and I'm sure all the efforts that you have mentioned, some of them are very granular and attention to the details, maybe sector-wise or action-wise, department-wise. Of course, it seems to be paying off, and I wish the team and I hope that we will be able to sustain this for several years. So I have 3 points to mention to the Secretary and 2 points to mention to the Minister, and you may choose to respond in the way you think appropriate. So for the Secretary, the 3 points are as follows. Early harvest scheme and comprehensive agreements. So could you throw some light on the apparent difference, I mean, if not conflict, because you mentioned UK, Canada, Australia, Israel maybe, and there's always mention of, or UAE, there's always mention of trying to exploit early harvest scheme in the sense of short-term, some short-term fruit, short-term success. But that sort of, in my mind at least, goes contrary to the spirit of a complete overall comprehensive FTA. So maybe is there a way that you're reconciling the two? And I'm reminded of the early harvest scheme that we signed a long time ago. One of the earliest ones was with Thailand, which is 17 years old, and it was 83 product lines. And I'm not sure how much we expanded. So first point is about EHS vis-a-vis comprehensive FTAs. The second point is about, which has been already mentioned, but I just want to highlight it anyway, that I'm very happy to note that India is very firmly embracing and committed to the concept of participating in the global value chains. But what that also means is that the value added is to be part of global value chains is, I think, the right strategy and policy. But that also means that the value added could be a small part of the entire value chain, or it as a proportion of total value. And this is again is different from the earlier strategy of insisting that FTA partners have to have 35-40% value addition or tariff line change. So is India's strategy is that we are able to reconcile the two, that very aggressively going with a GVC strategy, but at the same time, are we giving up the value addition norms which we used to insist on earlier, or are we finding a way to reconcile? And the third point, the Secretary, is about, you mentioned that the new regime, all the trade agreements are going way, way beyond what was considered to be essential trade elements to trade agreements. I mean, I'm reminded of Professor Bhagwati, who used to say that these are all trade unrelated, but increasingly everything, labor standards and environmental standards, and of course, climate change issues are considered, in fact, almost to the point of becoming mainstream. The EU is contemplating a carbon tax where anything which is exported there, if it has energy which is used from burning coal, will be subject to something like $25, $30, $40 per ton. It's already the proposal is already on the table. So my question to you, Secretary, is that does India is it fully for this, or how do we factor that in our negotiations? These are all sort of little difficult or maybe longer questions, but I'm happy if you just give brief answers or just indicative. Minister, thank you again and welcome, because I know that India and Peru have been negotiating. I think we have had several rounds of negotiations, and I hope the FTA, some agreement is reached soon. I have two questions for you. I'm very happy to know, by the way, that you are Trade and Tourism Minister. I hope India takes note that we often sometimes relegate tourism as if it's not part of trade. I think I often like to say that even if we get say 1 or 2% of the outbound tourism from China into India, that will add significantly to export earnings, but we often don't think of tourism. So I think we should learn from Peru, that trade and tourism. So I just want to know whether how much is tourism, how much do you integrate tourism in your trade policy? And second question is about CPTPP, that do you see what is the roadmap ahead? Do you see the US joining? I believe now the UK also is going to join. So do you see that, and what is the roadmap ahead? What is the implication for other mega arrangements like the RCEP and so on? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajit. Dr. Chanda, if I can also ask you to give your comments and questions, and then I'll request the speakers to take both.
Sure. Can you hear me? I'm audible?
Yes.
Okay. So good evening, everyone, and thank you to Mr. Subramaniam and Mr. Losa for very insightful comments. I think many of the questions have actually been asked by the previous two panelists. So let me just come to one particular thing, which is about the general view that FTAs by India have not yielded the desired benefits. So a lot of different reasons have been given, whether it's the design of the agreement, the choice of trading partners, the nature of our trade basket, or maybe lack of competitiveness. In your view, Mr. Subramaniam, how do you look at the reasons for why we've not been able to successfully leverage our FTAs? Is it our mindset and our very defensive approach? You alluded to that. So that's my first question to you. The second is, when we look at this issue of choice of trading partners, now increasingly we are hearing about, from look east, look west, we have more complementarity with them. At the same time, I mean, if you consider the Asian partners that we've had, while we may not have, been able to expand significantly our exports, in fact, in some markets, our exports have stagnated while imports have increased. Well, I don't personally agree with this whole mindset of always looking at trade balances as the lens for evaluating whether an FTA is beneficial or not, because imports can also be beneficial. They can bring in better quality and technology, etc. But how do you look at these two different sets of markets in terms of your negotiating strategy? Do you have a differentiated approach towards the West versus the developing countries of the East and the developed countries in the East which actually can bring you the technology and the value addition. So Japan and Korea would stand very differently from your ASEAN partners versus the US and the EU. Apart from the more comprehensive and regulatory and other issues, WTO plus sort of issues you might have to negotiate with the EU or UK. So do we have such a calibrated strategy? The next question that I would like to ask is, about the mindset. You talked about being willing to negotiate and give deeper concessions, because if you want something, you have to also give something. Now, so a question similar to what actually Ajit Ranade asked is, how ambitious are we going to be? Are we just looking at mini level FTAs, very quick sort of results, or are we really going to a full-fledged sort of FTA, and how much are we willing to give in terms of depth and breadth of concessions? Another question that I have is about our approach. One of the things I found is that, we have a siloed approach to our negotiations. So it was very heartening to hear that you're talking of restructuring and, having a more integrated sort of structure within the Commerce Ministry, because increasingly you cannot separate out the trade in goods from trade in services to investments, technology. And so one needs a more integrated as opposed to a siloed strategy in your negotiations and the way you look at cross benefits across sectors. And if I were to just give an example, I mean, even when we look at services exports, we've been just harping about mode 4, but mode 3 brings mode 4, mode 3 brings mode 1. So business interest, establishing commercial presence would actually give you the benefits in other modes. Or you can think about bringing in FDI, and that promotes exports or domestic value, and within that you integrate your services and embed it and through servicification. So the way we look at all these different lines of negotiation also has to change. To what extent is that happening on the ground? Another question I have is about trade-offs. To what extent are we really exploiting possible trade-offs either within sectors or across sectors? So for instance, if you look at the UK's case, you want non-discriminatory access to the UK's government procurement market in the case of IT. They want something in the liquor market. Are we looking at these sort of cross-product, cross-services versus product trade-offs? Another actually question that comes to mind is this relationship between multilateralism and our approach in bilaterals. And this came up because Mr. Losa mentioned how what they're doing with their bilaterals is also in consonance with what they're doing multilaterally. But that's not the case for us. If we are going to be, talking of 18 chapters with Australia and UK, and which means taking on a lot of WTO plus or the more deeper sort of area, maybe sustainable development, labor, environment, etc. We're talking of investment facilitation, and yet we are not willing to discuss these multilaterally. So are we building our bilaterals and our experience there as stepping stones towards a multilateral, or are we potentially undermining our position multilaterally? I just wanted to understand the relationship between our bilateral approach and our multilateral approach. One could clearly argue that India should be sitting with investment facilitation for development. Why not be party to the discussions on e-commerce? Because it's something of interest to us. We have a market, we have potential players. So we should be shaping the discussion. And finally, a set of questions regarding how well we align our domestic policies with our FTA strategy. I mean, Atmanirbhar Bharat gives a sort of flavor of import substitution, while we talk about, our interest in integrating into global and regional value chains, but somehow this sort of recent duty hikes or the thing of make it in India, in today's world nothing gets totally made anywhere. So how well are we able to integrate our schemes like say the PLI scheme or other initiatives we have with the FTA strategy and our strategy vis-a-vis different partners in FTAs? So these were some of the questions I had to you. Please feel free to take whichever ones you would be interested in answering. And to Mr. Losa, I think one question I had was, how different has your negotiation with India been as opposed to other countries in terms of sticky points and on issues such as mobility or the service sector? Because in services, of course, there are so many behind the border barriers, it's much more difficult to negotiate. And a second thing is, to what extent can an India-Peru sort of FTA bilateral provide an entry point for India or Peru into third markets? So I'm looking from the Indian side into Mercosur as well as into North America, from say nearshoring in the Latin American market to the North American market. So again, how do we strategize and broaden the benefits that we get from a bilateral into third countries and larger markets? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe I'll request the Minister to go first because the questions are fewer, and then we'll come to Mr. Subramaniam.
Thank you, Mr. Vani. Okay, do you hear me well? Yes. Mr. Ajit posed two questions, one related with CPTPP and implications in the future with the accession process of other trading partners. For us in Peru, we are focusing the implementation of the CPTPP. We put it in place 2 months ago. So our main focus is in it, and also in the accession process of the United Kingdom, which is formally in process. They send a request, the CPTPP members analyze it and agreed to have an accession process working group. We know that there are other countries that has sent that request, such as China or Chinese Taipei, which have to be discussed within the framework of the CPTPP to find a definition on this by consensus. And of course, whatever this accession process goes to had an implication with other mega blocks such as RCEP, or in the case of APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, there is this long-term goal of creating a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So we have the expectation for the CPTPP that any member that could become, any country willing to become a part of the CPTPP can fulfill the highest standards of the CPTPP in all the chapters that make part of this agreement. And that would be the way that we will measure the willingness of a country to be part of the CPTPP. No, the capacity of the country to fulfill the highest standards provisions of the CPTPP. The other question was related with the tourism sector. In Peru, tourism is quite important. Before the pandemic, it represented 3.4% of our GDP, in part due to inbound tourists, but also domestic tourists making trips within the territory, the Peruvian territory. We have two vice ministries, one for foreign trade, the other for tourism. Both of us has our strategic plans, and also we work with the regional government so we can continue developing capacities in tourism and in foreign trade. There is a big coordination between both teams, and tourism indeed is also part of our trade policy, seeing it as an export of services. But there is a exclusive vice ministry working on the tourism development in the country. Both of us under the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Tourism. The other question by Mrs. Rupa was how we can see the opportunities for our free trade agreement to allow the entry of India into other trade partners, for example, in South America. Part of the objective of the negotiation of our FTAs is to Peru to become a hub in the region, in Latin America, for investment. For companies who invest in Peru, they could have also access to the other trade partners to which Peru has a free trade agreement. Peru has a free trade agreement with most of the countries in America, from Canada to Chile and Argentina. There are a few countries which we don't have a free trade agreement in place. So the investment in Peru is the door that we can, is an open door where investor could also have access to the rest of the region. So I see it as an opportunity, as well as we could see Peruvian investors going to India and having access to South Asia, for example. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Subramaniam, too many questions, but over to you.
I go very fast because we have other things and we need to move on. Number one, the question about early harvest or comprehensive. Actually, we're no longer using the word early harvest. We're calling them interim agreements. And the purpose, I remember the reference to the Thai FTA, where we only have an early harvest and nothing after that. The purpose is like this. And this is not something we are doing with UAE or Israel. UAE is a single shot agreement. Israel will be a single shot agreement. These are countries where we are going to have very large, very deep engagements and covering many areas, both traditional and non-traditional. Therefore, what an interim agreement does, it generates quick wins. The problem with free trade agreements, the losers make noise, the winners don't make any noise. And that creates constituencies which go against an FTA. So you actually have early wins which then start supporting and create a pool of support for the FTA. 3, to prevent the Thailand kind of a situation, there can be inbuilt clauses within the interim itself about having a sunset clause, whereby the benefits of that interim agreement vanish unless the final FTA is concluded within an agreed time frame. So when I say confidently that we'll have a final agreement by December and an interim by March, the interim agreement will actually have a provision saying that the final has to come in by so and so. And the reason for doing it early is you get market access that much earlier. So I think that's the reason. And it also creates a momentum. It creates an atmosphere. Otherwise, what have we done? There are some cases where I have negotiated agreements for years and got stuck on a few little molehills, and then they have become mountains, and we have lost the benefits for the rest of the stuff which could have actually come through. EU is a classic example. So I think that's one. The second one, it's a very interesting one. Have you changed your rules of origin and the value addition norms to become part of global value chains? It's like this. When you're part of a global value chain, you're actually part of the international export market. And rules of origin are actually in an FTA for actually supplying to the domestic market. So fundamentally, what we need is, and there is also an agreed principle in government that taxes will not be exported, tariffs will not be exported. The problem is the way our rules operate. They're so complicated that people who are actually into a global value chain in India face immense hassles. And it's not a tariff hassle. The tariff is refundable. They can go for advance authorization. They've got many other things. Or they have to locate themselves in an SEZ. They're actually rewriting the SEZ law, in which basically if there is a unit there, when it's facing the domestic market, it will behave like a domestic tariff area entity. And if it's facing the international market, it will behave like an SEZ. It will still be one unit. That's going to be a breakthrough when we get it through the next session of Parliament. Because then what will happen is it will have two doors, one to the front and one to the back. And so therefore, and they economize on capacity, on demand, etc. On the FTA generation 2, about these new areas that we are entering to, they are not traditional trade things. Is India ready for it? I have a counter question. Does India have a choice? Question is, you don't engage or you engage. If you want to talk to the EU, UK, Australia, Canada, they're going to say, let's talk environment, let's talk gender, let's talk government procurement. And mind you, we are talking government procurement. It's part of the deals. So the same India, which is not a member of the WTO Plurilateral Government Procurement Agreement, is talking government procurement bilaterally. I'll jump to the last question. This is about how does this bilateral versus WTO thing is. Let me honestly say, we probably don't have that much experience and capacity in these new areas. The departments concerned with those areas actually have never looked international and as agreements. Therefore, I think the bilateral does two things. It builds up our capacity in a more secure environment. In the WTO, you are facing a full-blown 180 membership. Here we do it bilaterally, cut our teeth, and once a certain comfort level is reached, when you have broken down domestic opponents who to understand the benefits of this particular area, then you actually multilateralize it. So we actually look at these as stepping stones on which we'll build up a larger multilateral agreement. I foresee a future 10 years down the road when we'll be having a different approach in the WTO on a lot of these issues if we have already done bilateral deals, say, on MSMEs with 10 different advanced economies. That's one. The question about FTA having not yielded benefits, this is something one talks a lot. There are two sides to it. Maybe they were not negotiated with it takes services. A focus has been mode 4, mode 4, mode 4. I mean, with all this, COVID and, work from home, it's actually mode 1 and mode 3 and all these other things which are far more important. And 2, mode 4 is happening autonomously. Indian nurses are wanted wherever they're wanted and they will go. Why the hell do we have to block an agreement for that? So I think there is a general realization in government. And when we're actually not talking, we're not pressing for that. The second thing, I think it's important in the past FTAs, have we marketed them well? Have we exploited the opportunities? Commerce Ministry is very happy with actually signing an agreement then forgetting it. I mean, does our export community know what are all the areas where they have actually got access? I mean, do we actually produce combined tables where, you know, you have good market access? Thirdly, countries have very specific strategies. Like the Vice Minister from Peru has said, using a country in an FTA as a base to supply other countries in that region. I think that's something India has not done. Take Singapore FTA. The SECA with Singapore is not for the Singapore market. It's actually using Singapore as your, zone there to actually penetrate other parts. I don't think that story has been sold well enough. And I think that's why trade promotion, which has been missing in commerce, is an essential part of commerce's agenda. Unless you do trade promotion, we will be locked very, very internally. The issue about look east, look west. I do not subscribe that we are stopping to look at east. Whatever we say, China is as big a trade partner as anybody else. US has overtaken China, but it's still there. Also, we don't look at country balances. It's irrelevant. Our deficit with one country mirrors our surplus with some other country. People think India exports raw materials and imports manufactured goods. The single biggest commodity group which is India's export is engineering goods. If we touch $400 billion this year, 100 billion will be engineering. It's not tea, coffee, iron ore anymore. So I think that's a change in perception that has to be there. The other issue is about mindsets in negotiation. That's a very important point. The way you negotiate in WTO is different. Because you are looking at a much larger menu of countries and a large, you need to strike something where you get everything everywhere. In an FTA, when two partners are discussing, it has to be a much more honest, trusting approach. The idea is there's a political commitment to do an FTA, say India with Peru. We go with open arms saying, look, how good can we do? When you go to the WTO, you go with a defensive mindset. What is the harm I can avoid? So I think I think that's important. That's why we have split it, because an officer who wears a WTO hat finds it very difficult to wear a bilateral hat. So those mindset. So actually create separate pools of expertise, because you have to understand human limitations. Other is about ambitions. These FTAs are going to be very ambitious. We're talking of 90, 100%, 90+% integration. Tariff lines being exchanged. I mean, on average, India's tariffs are about 15%. That's what we see. When we talk to UAE, their average tariffs are 5%. But you will see that there's going to be dramatic integration on many fronts, and I think they're going to be very meaningful. Let's be very clear. When you're doing a bilateral FTA, the other side is as smart as you are. So if there is no deepening of the engagement, they're not going to come across. So I think there has to be honesty, truthfulness, and a willingness to engage very deeply. And I think that is there. We're also creating massive training capacities. We need much larger pools of negotiators. Suppose 3 years from now, we're going to be having 20 other FTAs under discussion with other parts of the world. We need that pool of people. So I think there's going to be a lot of restructuring. There'll be experts, there'll be academics, there'll be private sector people, and regular people from the civil service, all mixing in groups which are multidisciplinary and also multifunctional. So we will do that, and hopefully we will see the results in the future. There is a lot of internal policy coherence that is needed. And that is going to come in. We're going to institutionalize a lot of things. An FTA is not about just exchanging tariff line. There has to be an approach. There has to be an agreement on how deep and how broad it is going to be. They go step by step, finalize the terms of reference, and then go ahead and complete it. All these are going to be cast in stone so that, when future teams go ahead and do, they have a template. There is no such template till yesterday. We're still in the process of creating one, and hopefully we will do well. I'll thank you all, and I think it's been a wonderful interaction.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Veer, we can't hear you. Veer, you are on mute.
I'm so sorry. I just wanted to thank Mr. Subramaniam, Mr. Losa, and my 3 panelists. Thank you for a wonderful interaction. We're 8 minutes late, so I won't hold you all back. Just to wish everyone a wonderful evening and a wonderful partnership summit. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.